For the last line of Vav Modal of 6a, the very last line. Our discussion is whether the presence of witnesses knowing what happened behind closed doors, whether that renders the Sotah waters invalid. The Torah says there are no witnesses to the event. There are no witnesses to the event, meaning we know that they secluded themselves, this woman and this other man. We don't know what happened behind closed doors. That's what the Torah says. And the Torah says there's no witnesses. Earlier, a couple of weeks ago, when we first were introduced to that verse, which says there is no witnesses, we used that verse to deduce that if there was one witness, that would be sufficient, even though ordinarily we need two. If one witness knows what happened behind closed doors, she's no longer a Sotah, even though ordinarily we need two witnesses to know what happened behind closed doors. But now the Gemara uses that same verse to tell us, in our Shesh's view, that the only way the waters of the Sotah are valid is if there are no witnesses in the world. The existence of witnesses somewhere out in the world who know what happened renders the waters ineffective. That's what the Mishnah is discussing. That's what the Gemara is discussing. And the Gemara came to this conclusion because our Mishnah implied that witnesses are of use even after she drank the water. Now, if the water is effective 100% of the time, then what would be the point of witnesses coming to tell us what happened behind closed doors after she drank the water? The waters will tell us what happened. Either she'll die or she'll live. So what are the presence of witnesses for? So the fact that the Mishnah validates the presence of witnesses even after she drank the Sotah waters means that there's a variable. And therefore the waters are not effective 100% of the time. Sometimes they're not. And therefore we need witnesses to come and tell us what happened. Was she intimate or was she not intimate? Because it's possible, and this is Rav Shesh's view, that the reason why she's alive after drinking the waters is not because she's innocent, really she's guilty. But the reason why she's still alive is because there was witnesses somewhere out there, and their presence renders the waters ineffective. So the fact that she survived after drinking the waters is not conclusive evidence that she is innocent. It could be it's because there's a presence of witnesses somewhere. And when those witnesses arrive, now we'll know. That was Rav Shesh's view. Rav Yosef's view was, no, the presence of witnesses do not render the waters invalid. And yet there's still a variable. Namely, perhaps she is guilty, maybe she was intimate behind closed doors, and yes, the water is still not effective. Because she has some merit. She did some mitzvah, which Hashem decided is a reason enough to make her survive, even though she drank the Sotah waters. And therefore, the fact that a woman drank the Sotah waters and is still alive is not proof that she's innocent. Maybe she's innocent, and maybe she has some other merit. And that's why she survived. And therefore, the witnesses are valid to arrive now. That's where we're at in the Mishnah, in the Gemara. Now let's see the Gemara further. Last line of Vav Medalef, the last line of 6a. Mosiv Rav Yosef. Rav raised the following objection. As I mentioned yesterday, the term, when we introduce a question with the word Mosiv, it means we're about to introduce a text that's greater than the one speaking. The people speaking here, the sages speaking here are Rav Yosef and Rav Sheshes, who are both scholars of the Gemara age, Amoraim, and whereas Rav is about to quote a Mishnaic age text, which predates the sages speaking here. And that text reads as follows. The Elu, and these are, where does the text come from? Let's see, Yod. Oops. Just see where it's from. Okay, it seems like it's a Mishnah later in our Gemara, later in Sotah. Anyway, the Mishnaic text reads as follows, the last three-line words on the line of the page. The Elu and the following are those shemin chayseya and nisrafis, that their offerings are burnt. What we're referring to here is the Sotah woman brings an offering as well. Her offering is called a mincha. Mincha are offerings that are made of, that are flour-based. And this is a barley-based flour, which is unusual. Usually it's a wheat flour-based flour. This is a barley-based flour, which the Gemara is going to discuss later. So she brings a barley flour-based offering. Now, the law of offering is as follows. If it's worthy of being brought onto the altar, then it's brought onto the altar, obviously. If, however, something happens that causes it to be invalid, but that item has already become holy, it's already been consecrated. So it's consecrated, so it's become designated holy material, but it cannot be brought to the altar for something that happened. So what happens is this thing gets burnt. It cannot revert back to its ordinary state that anybody can buy it in the market and eat it, because it's already been rendered holy, but it cannot be brought on the altar. So there's a certain space in the temple in which all these kinds of invalidated offerings are disposed of, or burnt, essentially. Burnt. So the Gemara now is saying that with respect to the Sotah, here is a list of things that might happen that would render this woman's offering invalid, thus making it need to be burnt. So it cannot be brought in the temple, but it's already past a certain point in which it cannot revert back to being just ordinary barley that anybody can buy in the market. It's already been made holy, but not valid to be offered, and thus it has to be burnt. So it's in this in-between stage.
When you say burnt, you mean not burned on the altar?
Not burnt on the altar. It's called the Beit HaDeshen. It's a separate spot in which all these things are burnt. Not on the altar, that's correct. Okay, so now at the top of page 6b, says the Gemara, here are the things that would invalidate her offering, and thus it has to be burnt. Two cases. Number one, one who says, I'm guilty. I misbehaved behind closed doors. They have witnesses. She's just like the woman, so we know she was secluded with this other man, and she now admits, because they keep on pressuring her, saying, those waters were erasing God's name because of you. This is going to cause terrible things for you. And she says, you know what? I admit I'm guilty.
So the
Sotah is called off at that point. So what happens to the offering that she brought? This is the case where the offering is burnt. Case number two, or if witnesses arrived and said she tameh that we saw what happened behind closed doors, and she was guilty. She was intimate. That's case number two, in which the offering would be burnt. That's the Mishnah text. Now Rab is going to deduce from here a challenge to the previous Gemara. So first, Rab analyzes this. The asu edim emas. Let's take the second case, where the witnesses arrive and say, we know what happened behind closed doors. She was intimate. When did they arrive? When did they say their testimony? At which point? So obviously it's before she drank the water. Well, let's not assume that anything yet. The asu edim emas. When did the witnesses arrive to inform us that she was intimate? If you're going to suggest that the witnesses arrived before the offering was placed in one of the holy vessels, because the moment this flour was placed in the holy vessels, klishares, vessels belonging to the temple, whatever it's called, the pan or the cup, whatever the thing is, in which the offering is placed. Once it's placed in there, now it's consecrated holy. Now, if the witnesses arrived before that happened, so this flour is not holy anymore, not holy yet. It's not consecrated. So why should it get burnt? It doesn't. It could return to its state of ordinary flour, which anybody can buy in the market. You have to redeem it because the money that you spent on buying this has been designated money to be used in the temple. So you would redeem it.
Redeeming, though, implies that it's already consecrated. Right?
Okay, so there's kedushas aguf and there's kedushas mammon. Is the value of it consecrated, or is the actual physical item consecrated? If the value of it is consecrated, that happens the moment I donate. Once I donate, then the value of it is consecrated, and therefore I can redeem it for its value. But the actual item is not consecrated. It's the value of it that's been consecrated. Okay, so I'll redeem it. But once this physical item has been put into the holy vessels, now the physical item is consecrated, and I can't redeem it anymore. Because it's not the value that became holy, it's the actual physical flour that's become holy. And at that point, it has to be burnt. And therefore, if these witnesses arrived to inform us that she was intimate before the flour was placed in this consecration, then the only issue here is the value, and redeem it and let the flour be used in the market. Anybody can use it for personal use.
Could it be still used in the temple for another mint offering?
I believe so. Somebody else can buy it, and yeah, somebody else, I believe. Robert here is asking if it can be used for another site later. I believe the answer is yes. If returned back to its regular mundane state, and somebody else can buy it, and somebody else can use it, I assume. Why not? I believe so. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think so. Okay, so now these witnesses obviously did not arrive before the flour became holy, because if it's before the flour became holy, there's no reason to burn it. There's no reason to dispose of it. Redeem it and let it be used for some other purpose. So Ella, therefore, we must say, third line, second to last word, Labasar de Kodesh. It must be, therefore, that the flour was already put in to the already put into the kli sharas, already put into the vessel, and now it's become consecrated holy, and therefore the witnesses come and say she's intimate. The sotah is called off, but you have this flour that's already been made holy, therefore it goes to be burnt. Now here comes the question. Here comes Rav's challenge. It's a brilliant challenge. You got to follow this because it's a little bit of a mind twister. Now let's introduce the variable of the presence of witnesses. Right? So these witnesses arrived to tell us that she was intimate. That means there was always witnesses. In Rav Yosef's view, the presence of witnesses out there in the world render the Sotah waters ineffective. I'm sorry, Rav Shesh's view. Right? Rav Yosef said that the only other variable is merit. That's what might prevent the waters from being effective. But Rav Sheshes is of the view that the presence of witnesses somewhere out in the world, even if we don't know about them, renders the water ineffective. Which means this Sotah woman, right from the start, was an ineffective Sotah. If that's the case, then her offering was invalid before it started. If that's the case, consecration should be of no value, because it was never an appropriate offering. The only time an offering becomes consecrated is if it's something that is appropriate to be offered.
Almost like have standing.
That's correct. It had no standing to begin with. And if that's the case, the presence of witnesses should never turn the offering into rendering it invalid. In fact, if anything, the presence of witnesses will inform us that it never was valid, allowing it to be used for
confirmation.
It's confirmation that it was never valid, and therefore the consecration never took hold, and therefore this flour should be returned to its regular, ordinary state automatically. Why would it be burnt by the presence of witnesses, even if it made it even if it was put into the cup? Because the whole consecration was invalid, was on a false premise. It was a false premise to begin with. It's correct. It never took hold. Following, Scott? Or?
Yeah, but the part is once it went into the vessel,
becomes consecrated. Once it went into the vessel, becomes consecrated. But that's only effective if it is being done under a correct premise.
right?
Which means the person who's putting it into the vessel is someone who actually is supposed to be bringing an offering. Whereas we just found out she wasn't supposed to. And we just found out that from the beginning, her entire Sotah was a lie. And not just it was a lie, because the lie is, a Sotah is always a question of a lie, right? Because you don't know what happened behind closed doors. Either she's lying or she's not lying when she says she's innocent. And that's the whole premise of the Sotah. But here it's more than that. The presence of witnesses, in Rav Yosef's view, render the waters ineffective. And if the waters are ineffective, that means, if the waters are ineffective, then that means that that the Sotah isn't the real Sotah. She's only bringing these offerings so that the water should be effective for her. But the waters aren't effective because it's the presence of witness.
Would there be a difference between ineffective and invalid? It could still
Yes, correct. There's a difference between ineffective and invalid.
Ineffective meaning that it's in sort of like in abeyance. It's not mean that it's
Okay,
called off. It could just be that.
Explain your question further. In which scenario are you talking about? Play it out.
With what Rob said.
So
he's kind of considering it to be invalid. That Sotah's been invalid if there's witnesses out
Right.
there.
If witnesses out there, Sotah's been
Bringing
invalid.
a mint offering is completely
Of no use.
irrelevant.
Yes, irrelevant. That's correct.
Right?
That's the question right now. That the fact that the witnesses out there in the world means her entire Sotah premise was invalid, and therefore the fact that you put these barley into the into the barley flour into the
Should have never been,
is of no, it doesn't mean it's a meaningless act.
So the vessel doesn't automatically make,
The vessel only makes the items holy if it is being brought on behalf of someone who's supposed to bring it.
but did you-
For it, it's if it's being brought for someone whom the offering will be of use to. But because the waters are ineffective by dint of the fact that there are witnesses out in the world, then this offering is of no use to her, because the whole offering is being brought, so the water should later do its effect on her. But these waters are ineffective considering that there are witnesses out there, in Rav Shesh's view. And thus the fact that she brought the offering into the temple, she brought the offering in an ineffective end. Right, the point of the offering is that the water should eventually test her. But in her case, the waters are ineffective. So she brought an offering for an ineffective end, and therefore the offering is irrelevant.
maybe in Dr. Chase's argument to that is that it's ineffective but not invalid. Meaning that maybe Hashem takes
Right,
care
but
of it in a sense.
yes, but once the witnesses arrive, you're right. In other words, we are doing all the right steps because we don't know what happened, right?
Right.
So we are doing the fact. No one's blaming us for making her bring an offering and putting it into the klishayot, into the holy vessels. No one's blaming us for that. But the question is, now that we know what happened, now we can determine the true value of this flour, and we can determine that the true value of the flowers is nothing, because when she brought the offering, it was to no end. The end is that the water that the water should inform us what happened, and in this case, the waters will not inform us what happened. So she brought it to no end, to no effective end. So let's see how the Gemara reads this. So fourth line, first word. All is well if you are of the view, like Rav Yosef, that the waters are effective even with the presence of witnesses. So Alma Bas Bekadish Bekarav. Then that means in Rav Yosef's view, where the presence of witnesses do not render the water ineffective. The only variable is whether she has merit, but the presence of witnesses do not render the waters ineffective. This is Rav Yosef's view. And if that's the case, then even though witnesses came and said she was intimate, when she brought it under correct circumstances, because the presence of witnesses don't render the waters invalid. Even though right now there's no reason to drink the waters because we know what happened, but when she brought it, it was still effective. And had those witnesses not arrived, the water would have been effective. And if the water would have been effective, so is their offering effective. And therefore it's time to burn these flour because it was put into the holy vessels. And sorry, yeah?
Or if it wasn't at that point put in the holy vessel, the money value.
Yeah. And therefore v'chi kadosh, and therefore if she did put it into those, if it was put into the holy vessels, meikara to begin with before the witnesses did it, shaper kadosh indeed became holy. It indeed became consecrated, because the presence of witnesses didn't render it ineffective. This is a very serious view. And therefore menchasa, this offering, this refus is burnt. It cannot be brought into the altar because the Sotah, in other words, let's put it this way. Does the presence of witnesses arriving, does it stop the Sotah in its tracks, or does it inform us that the entire premise of the Sotah was wrong? In Rav Yosef's view, the premise of the Sotah was correct, because we don't know what happened. The witnesses arrive, it stops the Sotah from this point going forward.
Everything prior to that was
Completely perfect.
procedure.
Correct. Everything prior to that was standard procedure. And therefore, if we went through with the waters before the witnesses arrived, those waters would be effective because everything we did was perfect. Now that the witnesses arrived, from now going forward, our information is new and we treat the law differently. But Rav is saying that, Rav Sheshes is saying, the moment that the witnesses arrive, that informs us that from the beginning, the whole thing was off. And therefore, had the witnesses not arrived, the waters wouldn't have been effective because the witnesses exist. And if that's the case, then the offering was brought in false premise and therefore never became consecrated and therefore no reason to burn it.
The problem with that view
Yes.
is that if it's not that the witnesses are there, but that the witnesses are out there in the world,
Yeah.
then the whole process of Sotah doesn't work because you never know if there's witnesses out there in the world.
Correct. Robert Burke is making the point we made yesterday from Rav Shimon. Did you saw yesterday's class?
Huh?
Did you watch yesterday's class?
No, I didn't. Sorry.
Yesterday's class, we actually mentioned that issue, and there is an opinion that actually disregards this entire discussion for precisely that reason.
Okay.
There is a view which says that the waters have to be effective 100% of the time, otherwise you're undermining the law of the Sotah. This is the view of Rabbi Shimon, but the Gemara here does not take that view. So we discussed that yesterday, but that's a good point. It means it's on point. Okay, so and if the Gemara says like this, Ella, rather, but if you are going to suggest, if you're going to take the view of Rav Sheshes, that the presence of witnesses render the waters ineffective, and therefore, as soon as the witnesses arrive, to Galai Milsalam Afreya, that informed us retroactively, that when she went through the process of consecrating this offering, Mikara, to begin with, Betos Kadosh, it was made consecrated on a false premise, and therefore typical chulin, and therefore this flour should be revert back to its ordinary state of regular ordinary flour that can be used in the market, because the presence of witnesses inform us that from the beginning it was a false premise. So then, in an obvious view, under what circumstances would the arrival of witnesses make us burn the offering? That was the Mishnah. That was the Mishnah Rav quoted. The Mishnah stated that when witnesses arrive and tell us that she was intimate, we burn, as a result of that testimony, we burn the offering. When would you ever do that? But in Rav Shesh's view, even if the witnesses arrive after the flour is put into the holy vessel, if the witnesses' arrival tell us that to begin with it was never consecrated, retroactively invalidates it. So in Rav Shesh's view, the arrival of witnesses should never make us burn the offering. It just makes the offering say it was never valid and redeem it and send it back to the market. So this is unbelievable. The Gemara's answer here is going to be mind-blowing. Hey, this got to raise your eyebrows, but it's incredible. Let's see. Amar Rav Yehuda Midiskarta, I think that's how you pronounce it. Rav Yehuda from a city called Diskarta explains. Kagain, for example, Shazinsa Bazara. She was intimate in the courtyard of the temple. And that's what these witnesses are coming to inform us. So when she put let's just think of the timeline. She was warned. She was secluded herself with a certain man. And now she's being brought to the temple as a Sotah. Valid bona fide Sotah, because we have no idea what happened behind closed doors. Now, then she got to the point where she put the flowers into the klisharis, into the holy vessel. The flower has now been consecrated under perfect permission, under correct circumstances, under a correct premise, because she's a bona fide Sotah. And now, between the time when the flower was consecrated, before she drank the waters, while she's in the temple, she engages intimately with somebody. And because she engaged intimately with somebody else, now, someone else, doesn't matter who it is. She was intimate with somebody in the temple. This is crazy. In the temple. So now she's no longer a Sotah. She's just someone who is unfaithful. So now she doesn't drink the water. But the flour was put under right circumstances, because the flour was put into the holy vessel on the premise of her original Sotah, which is still valid. But she doesn't drink the water because there's no reason to drink the water. We know now that she was unfaithful, not from the guy who she's secluded with. She was unfaithful with somebody else. It doesn't matter either way. She's unfaithful and no reason to drink the Sotah water. Wait a second. We're not done yet. Okay, so that's the Gemara's answer right now. That after the flour was put into the vessel under correct circumstances and thus consecrated, now she behaved inappropriately. She was unfaithful, and that's why she doesn't drink the water. But the flour was still consecrated under correct circumstances, and therefore the flour is burnt. But now the Gemara asks, and we can conclude with this answer and question and answer, which is even more mind-blowing. Maskef Rav Misharshia. Rav Misharshia raised the following objection. Whenever an objection is introduced with the word maskef, it means we are rejecting based on a logical premise. Masiv, which we quoted earlier, that was the other word we used to introduce the last question, means we're quoting a text that's greater than the one speaking. In this case was Mishnaic H text versus sages of the Gemara. And here, maskef means we're going to introduce a logical reduction. So Rav Misharshia challenges from a logical perspective and says, how could she have engaged intimately in the courtyard of the temple? The law is that there are young Kohanim that are meant to accompany her throughout the entire journey. So she's under a watchful eye. How could she have possibly engaged intimately? There's no, in other words, Misharshi is challenging and saying, how is it physically possible for it to be intimate in the Holy of Holies, in the Holy, in the, not the Holy of Holies, but in the courtyard of the temple? How could she be intimate there? There are people watching her. These Kohanim that are appointed to watch her.
That was the women's courtyard, or the regular courtyard?
I think the regular courtyard. It says, yeah, I think the regular courtyard. Yeah, she had to come to the regular courtyard because she had to come. She had
allowed in there?
no. There was a certain section where she came.
Oh,
There's a certain place where, and I still from memory, but there's a certain place she would come to the edge of the inner sanctum where she can be there to because the Kohen she had to, right, we're going to learn soon. We're going to learn soon, let's leave it alone, because we're going to learn soon the process of what happens when she comes to the temple and where she stands in a very specific place where she can reach the Kohen and so on. Anyway, but there are Kohanim who are accompanying her the entire time. And if these Kohanim are accompanying her the entire time, how is it possible that after the consecration of the flower, before she drank the water, she was intimate? How could she have done such a thing? She's under the watchful eye of the Kohanim. Answers the Gemara. And you guessed it. One of these attendees, they themselves were intimate with her. The possibility for a Kohen to be intimate with a woman that's in his care in the temple. And that's what would render that's what would make her no longer a Saita, so she doesn't drink the water. But the flower was still consecrated under correct circumstances because she was a Saita. And thus the flower is burnt. This is like Michael Chernick of blessed memory would always remind us of this famous teaching of the fact that on Yom Kippur at Mincha before Ne'ilah, we read in the Torah, the section of the Torah describing forbidden relations. And the teaching goes, and this is what Michael would always remind us, that when you're in the highest levels of holy spirituality, remember what you're capable of, and make sure you put guards up not to do that. So this would further magnify this point. The Gemara doesn't discount the notion that even in the holiest place, a Kohen who's doing his job, he's in the temple. It doesn't mean he no longer has inclination. It doesn't mean he no longer has his base urges. And unless he realizes he has the base urges, he will not be on guard to guard it. You know, that's one of the things that Tanya writes in chapter 13, that even someone who's a tzaddik should see himself, and he's really a tzaddik, so he has no conscious urges to sin, but he should see himself as if he is capable of sinning, because if he ever thinks he's incapable of sinning, his guard's lowered, and then he will sin. No matter how far a person has come, even if he's standing in the holy, in the temple, and even if he's a kohen, never lower your guard down. Remember, you're still a human being, and you're still capable of who knows what. And when you remember that, then that itself helps you stay away from it. It's quite remarkable. The Gemara's concluding hypothetical is a kohen being intimate with a woman who's entrusted in his care while he's in the temple. In this very short time between when there's a whole process going on. It's not like they're hanging out there for a week. There's a whole process going on. She brought the offering already. She's waiting for the Sotah water to be ready. And in this few minutes, I don't know how long it takes. He can't control himself.
That's also an interesting.
Mind blowing. So I don't know if this hypothetical ever played out, but this is the hypothetical the Gemara gives. Sorry, what were you going to say?
That's right. I just think the issue with the Cohen, you can analyze that whole situation too. Did he commit adultery for status? He's already not forbidden from her.
He definitely committed adultery because she's not divorced yet. And we don't know if she's even supposed to be divorced. Maybe she wasn't intimate, right? We don't know. She's a Sotah. So it's definitely full-on infidelity. And it's definitely completely forbidden to him to do this.
Right.
Like on 1,000 accounts. He's in the temple. She's a married woman. I mean, there's 1,000 reasons why he's not allowed to be on the highest degrees of and a Kohen himself is even more prohibited than ordinary Jew, than a regular Jew. Quite something. Anyway, okay, so the Gemara gives another answer. Rav Ashi says, Kagoin, for example, here's how the possibility that she could have been intimate during this time. So answer number one was that the Kohen themselves were intimate with her. Rav Ashi's answer is Kagoin Shenitzchel Nikfa, For example, she had to go to the bathroom. The atu pirche kunna b'kippah talila. Do the kohanim who are in whose care she's entrusted, do they have her by ball and chain? She went to the bathroom. She can sneak away for a few minutes. That's Rav Asher's answer. Not that she was intimate with these kohanim, but rather that she went off a few minutes to go to the bathroom and she found someone, or maybe she made up to be with somebody. I don't know what. But it's not it doesn't have to necessarily be the kohanim, because the kohanim don't have her like under lock and key. She asked to go to the bathroom, they'll let her, and they're not going to stand there and watch her go to the bathroom, obviously. So that's what the Gemara. Those are the two possibilities as to how she could have been intimate in the temple after consecrating the flower, thus making it legit consecration, but before she drank the Sotah waters, and because she was intimate, and witnesses come and say she was intimate, therefore the Sotah is called, the waters of the Sotah are called off, because she's no longer a Sotah, because she's actually unfaithful. But the flower was consecrated under correct circumstances because she was a Sotah. And therefore the flower is burnt rather than being offered on the altar, certainly not. And it's also doesn't revert back to ordinary flower because it was consecrated under correct circumstances. So this is where we are in the Gemara. Tomorrow the Gemara is going to take a different direction on this discussion. Is that what were you going to say?
If we didn't have these scenarios in the Kohanim having relations with the Sotah, then it would be unresolved as to what would happen to that mincha. Right? Yeah.
If we didn't have this hypothetical, then we would be stuck with how does
it burned, or does it go retroactive?
Right. Does it get burnt because it was consecrated, or does it return back to its state of ordinary flower if we didn't have this hypothetical of her being intimate in the interim? Yeah, but the Gemara is going to take a different approach, which is more a legal approach rather than a technical approach. We'll see. Okay, have a wonderful day, everybody.
Yeshikoach, Rabbi. God bless you. God bless you all. Have a wonderful day.
Wonderful day, bye.